In a quiet neighborhood undergoing rapid change, Gloria Hartman, a 68-year-old woman in a wheelchair, finds herself unexpectedly targeted by two police officers during a routine day. What starts as a peaceful afternoon quickly spirals into a confrontation fueled by bias and prejudice. With her son, Derek, a civil rights attorney, by her side, Gloria refuses to back down. This encounter sparks a legal battle that will test the limits of justice and challenge an entire community to confront its own deep-seated issues. Will Gloria and Derek find the justice they deserve, or will the system fail them as it has so many others? Watch as this emotional journey unfolds, showing the power of resilience and the fight for equality in the face of overwhelming odds. Now let's dive into Gloria's story. If you're moved by stories of courage and justice, hit subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss any updates. What do you think happens next in Gloria's fight for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Green Valley, a neighborhood in the midst of change. Gloria Hartman, 68 years old, sat in her wheelchair on her front porch, enjoying the soft breeze as it rustled the autumn leaves. The trees were turning red and gold, the chill in the air a subtle reminder that winter was far off. Gloria breathed deeply, savoring the moment. Independence was something she cherished, especially after years of learning to navigate life from her wheelchair. Her son, Derek, had offered countless times to help with her errands, but Gloria had always been a fiercely independent woman. Even after the accident that had bound her to the chair, she had insisted on handling things herself. Her home, where she'd lived for nearly 40 years, was full of memories. It was a constant, even as the neighborhood changed, some good changes, some less so. New condos replaced old homes, and new faces moved in, some smiling, others indifferent. Gloria wheeled herself down the wooden ramp her son had installed after her accident. It was sturdy and dependable like Derek. He was a civil rights attorney, well known for his work fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She was proud of him, but also aware of the weight he carried on his shoulders. Derek had offered to take her to the bank today, but she wanted to go alone. It was a small thing, but these little moments of self-sufficiency were important to her. She grabbed her bag, neatly packed with her checkbook, ID, and all the essentials. As she rolled down the quiet street, her thoughts drifted to Derek. He had always been a fighter, even as a child. Now, he was a man who stood up against a system that didn't always treat everyone equally. She had taught him to value justice and fairness, to never back down in the face of adversity. But Gloria also knew that the world had a long way to go before it could truly claim to be just. The familiar faces she passed on her way to the bank smiled warmly, nodding in greeting. She waved back, feeling a sense of peace. Despite the changes, this was her neighborhood, and she knew every crack in the sidewalk, every face on the street. As she reached the bank, Gloria felt a sense of pride wash over her. Another errand completed, another victory for her independence. Gloria had just finished her transaction at the bank, satisfied with how smoothly everything had gone. She checked her watch, still plenty of time to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. As she turned her wheelchair toward the exit, a young bank teller smiled at her and wished her a good day. Gloria returned the smile and wheeled herself out into the crisp air. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. His gaze hardened, the lawyer in him taking over. Green Valley was gentrifying, but Gloria held on to her roots here, where she had raised Derek and built a life for herself. As she made her way back home, Gloria turned onto a quieter street, one that always felt safe to her. But something felt different today. The air had shifted. Two police officers stood on the corner, seemingly watching her as she approached. One was tall with close-cropped hair, Officer Jack Miller. His sharp eyes followed her movements with a look that sent an unsettling chill through her. His partner, a shorter, broader man named Brian Caldwell, stood with his arms crossed, glancing in her direction, but not speaking. Gloria kept her composure. She'd been through enough in life to know when something wasn't right, but she also knew how to stay calm in tense situations. As she rolled closer, Officer Miller stepped forward, his face hard and uninviting. "Hey, where are you headed?" Miller asked, his tone laced with suspicion. His voice cut through the otherwise peaceful afternoon, and Gloria felt her chest tighten. She stopped her wheelchair, looking up at him calmly. "I'm just heading home, officer. Is there a problem?" Miller's eyes narrowed as he looked her over, as if he was trying to find something wrong. His partner Caldwell stood back, watching the exchange but not intervening. "ID," Miller said, holding out his hand. Gloria's brow furrowed. "Excuse me, I need to see some identification," he repeated, his voice carrying an air of authority that felt less about law enforcement and more about intimidation. Gloria hesitated. She hadn't done anything wrong. "Officer, I'm just on my way home. Is there a reason you need my ID?" Miller's expression darkened. "We ask the questions. Just show me your ID." Gloria's hands shook slightly as she reached into her bag, pulling out her ID. She handed it over, her mind racing. She had lived here for decades. She knew most of the officers who patrolled the neighborhood, but she had never seen these two before. Something about the way they were looking at her, like she didn't belong, set her nerves on edge. Miller snatched the ID from her hand, glancing at it quickly before passing it to Caldwell. "What's an old lady like you doing around here?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Gloria's stomach churned. She knew exactly what he was implying. Over the years, she had encountered subtle and not-so-subtle racism, but never like this. Never from someone who was supposed to protect and serve. "I live right down the street," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I've lived here for more than 30 years. Caldwell looked at the ID and handed it back, but the sneer on Miller's face remained. "People like you don't usually stick around when a neighborhood like this starts changing." Gloria clenched the handles of her wheelchair. "People like me," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Miller smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you know." The comment hung in the air like a bad odor, the thinly veiled racism stinging Gloria's pride. She wasn't going to be bullied, not in her own neighborhood, not by anyone. She had taught Derek to stand up for what was right, and she wouldn't betray her own principles now. "I know my rights, officer," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "And I'm not doing anything wrong." Miller's expression hardened. "Watch your tone, ma'am," he said, leaning in closer. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Gloria felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply going home. But she could feel the weight of Miller's authority pressing down on her, making every breath feel heavier. The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was about to happen. "You need to move along," Miller said, his voice sharp. "And be careful where you roll next time." Gloria took a deep breath, her hands tightening on the armrests of her chair. "I don't need your permission to go home." The defiance in her voice seemed to anger Miller. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "Maybe you need to learn some respect," he said coldly. Gloria's jaw clenched, but before she could respond, a voice from the crowd called out, "Leave her alone!" Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped the steering wheel. Gloria turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of a young woman in the crowd, her phone raised, filming the scene. Others were pulling out their phones too, the buzz of murmured voices growing louder as more people gathered. Miller's face twisted with irritation. He glanced at his partner, who shifted uneasily but didn't speak. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and he knew it. "We'll be watching you," Miller said, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "Don't cause any more trouble." With that, he turned sharply, motioning for Caldwell to follow him. Gloria watched them go, her heart still racing, but her resolve stronger than ever. She didn't say another word as she wheeled herself home, but the fire inside her burned hotter with every push of her chair. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The chill in the air had thickened since Gloria left the bank, but the tension in her chest was even heavier. After the unsettling encounter with Officers Miller and Caldwell, she returned to her home, her thoughts racing. She tried to settle down, but the frustration clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. She knew this neighborhood as well as she knew herself. Green Valley had been her home for decades, and she had never felt unsafe here until today. Later in the afternoon, she received a call from a concerned neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, who had witnessed the incident. "Gloria, I don't mean to alarm you, but I saw what happened earlier. Those officers, they seem to be looking for trouble." Gloria sighed, feeling the tension ease just slightly as she spoke to someone who understood. "I know, Mrs. Ellis. It's not the first time I've seen that look on a man's face. But it's different when it's the police." "Do you want me to call Derek, Mrs.?" Ellis asked. "He'd know what to do." Gloria paused. Derek had always been her protector, even when she didn't ask for it. As a civil rights attorney, he'd faced countless injustices in his work, and Gloria knew how much it weighed on him. She didn't want to add more stress to his already full plate. "Not yet," Gloria finally said, "but thank you for offering." After the call, Gloria found herself thinking about the officer's words. They had made her feel small in a place where she had once felt so confident. But she wasn't going to let them break her spirit. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she wasn't alone. The people in her neighborhood knew Hermione had seen the exchange, and some had even recorded it. She wouldn't be silenced, and she certainly wouldn't be intimidated. 2 days later, Gloria ventured out again, determined to continue living her life as she always had. She had errands to run, and she wasn't about to let fear keep her confined to her home. Rolling down the same street where the previous incident had occurred, she kept her head high, though her heart beat faster than usual. Just as she passed the local pharmacy, she saw them again, Officers Miller and Caldwell. This time, they were parked on the side of the street in their patrol car. Miller leaned against the hood, sipping coffee, while Caldwell checked his phone. Gloria's stomach churned, but she pressed forward, refusing to show any sign of fear. As she passed, Miller's gaze snapped toward her. He set down his coffee cup and straightened up, a smirk forming on his lips. Gloria felt the weight of his stare, but continued to wheel herself forward, hoping they wouldn't engage her again. "Hey!" Miller called out, his voice sharp. Gloria stopped, her pulse quickening as she turned to face them. "What now?" she asked, her voice calm but tired. Miller took a few steps toward her, his posture casual, but the intent behind his actions was clear. He wanted to assert his control, to remind her of his authority. "I thought I told you to watch yourself the other day," he said, his tone condescending. Gloria clenched her fists on the armrests of her wheelchair. "I'm just going about my business, officer. What do you want from me?" "You still don't seem to understand," Miller said, shaking his head slightly. "People like you need to know your place. That phrase again, people like you." Gloria felt her blood boil. "I know exactly where my place is," she said firmly. "It's right here, in this neighborhood, where I've lived for most of my life." Caldwell, who had been standing by the patrol car, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't as vocal as Miller, but his silence still felt complicit. Gloria looked between the two men, her heart pounding in her chest. As Gloria stood her ground, passers-by began to slow down, sensing another confrontation. A few people from the neighborhood, some of whom had been there during the first encounter, stopped to watch. Among them was Andrea Bell, a young journalist who had been following stories of police misconduct in the area. She recognized Gloria and quickly pulled out her phone, starting to record. Miller noticed the crowd forming and seemed to thrive on the attention. "See, you're making a scene now," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "You could just go home and avoid all this." "I'm not making a scene," Gloria replied, her voice firm but steady. "You're the one stopping me for no reason." "You're just looking for trouble," Miller muttered, taking a step closer. His words were low, but they carried the sting of disdain. "I'm looking for justice," Gloria shot back, louder this time. She wasn't going to be silenced. "And so is everyone watching." Andrea Bell moved closer, her camera still pointed at the interaction. "What are you doing to her?" she asked, her voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Why are you harassing her?" The question seemed to embolden the bystanders. Several others pulled out their phones and began recording, and the murmurs of discontent grew louder. Miller's smirk faded slightly as he glanced around, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. Caldwell, still standing near the car, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should let it go, Jack," he said quietly. "There's no need for this." But Miller, too deep into his ego, waved him off. "She needs to learn a lesson," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Gloria to hear. These people always think they can get away with everything. Gloria felt a surge of anger. She had done nothing wrong, nothing except live her life the way she always had. And now, these men were trying to strip her of her dignity, all because they didn't think she belonged. Gloria took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." The crowd, now numbering close to 30 people, began to murmur in support. A few voices called out, "Leave her alone, and she's done nothing wrong." The tension was thick in the air, and Gloria could feel the power of the community rallying behind her. Miller's face flushed with anger. "You think this crowd is going to save you?" he asked, his voice rising in frustration. "You're just making it worse for yourself." Before Gloria could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. "What's going on here?" Derek Hartman pushed through the throng of people, his eyes filled with barely concealed rage as he saw the two officers standing over his mother. He had been on his way to visit her after a long day at work, but when he saw the crowd gathered and recognized his mother's voice, his heart dropped. "What are you doing to my mother?" Derek demanded, stepping between Gloria and the officers. Miller crossed his arms, a sneer forming on his face. "Stay out of this. It's none of your business." Derek's eyes narrowed. "It's absolutely my business when you're harassing my mother. And if you think this is going to go unnoticed, you're dead wrong." The crowd grew silent as Derek faced the two officers. His presence, tall and commanding, seemed to shift the energy of the confrontation. He wasn't just any man standing up for his mother, he was a respected civil rights attorney, and he knew exactly what the officers were doing. "This stops now," Derek said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that neither officer could ignore. The tension escalates as Gloria faces the officers a second time, with verbal abuse and racial slurs driving the conflict. The crowd's growing support and the introduction of Derek, her son, raised the stakes, pushing the narrative toward the next turning point. Emotions continue to build, with the community rallying behind Gloria and her defiance setting the stage for an even greater confrontation. Derek Hartman stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides as he stared down officers Jack Miller and Brian Caldwell. The two men had been verbally abusing his mother, Gloria, for no reason other than their own prejudice, and Derek's blood was boiling. As a civil rights attorney, he had seen cases like this before, too many, in fact. But now it was personal. Gloria sat in her wheelchair, still calm despite the storm brewing around her. Her eyes met Derek's, and though her expression was stern, Derek could sense her relief at his presence. The crowd that had gathered around them grew in size, murmurs of disapproval rising as more phones were pointed at the officers. Miller crossed his arms, his face a mixture of frustration and disdain. "I told you to stay out of this," he snapped at Derek. "This is police business." Derek took a step closer, his voice low but steady. "You're harassing an innocent woman," he said, his eyes burning with controlled anger. "You have no right to stop her, and you certainly have no right to treat her like this." Miller glared back, his expression hardening. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not in front of so many people. But Derek wasn't just anyone, he was a lawyer, someone who knew the law better than most, and Miller could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Don't tell me how to do my job," Miller said, trying to regain control of the situation. "She was acting suspiciously, and we have every right to check her out." Derek's jaw tightened. He could feel the tension rising in the crowd, their discontent simmering just beneath the surface. Suspicious. My mother, a 68-year-old woman in a wheelchair, was acting suspiciously. Or was it that she didn't fit your idea of who belongs in this neighborhood? Miller's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Gloria spoke up, her voice strong and clear. "They're just looking for an excuse," she said, addressing the crowd as much as she was addressing Derek. "They don't want me here because I don't look like some of the new people moving in." Her words hung in the air, and Derek could feel the energy shift. The crowd, many of whom had witnessed the earlier incident, began to voice their support more openly. "She's right," someone shouted from the back. "This is harassment." Derek's eyes flicked over to Caldwell, the other officer. He had been quieter than Miller, but his discomfort was evident. Caldwell shifted nervously, glancing at the crowd, then at his partner. It was clear he was starting to feel the pressure, but he hadn't yet spoken up. Derek seized the opportunity. "Officer Caldwell," he said, his tone firm but measured. "You know this isn't right. You can still do the right thing here." Caldwell looked uncertain, his eyes darting between Derek and Miller. For a moment, it seemed like he might step back, distance himself from the situation. But then Miller shot him a hard look, and Caldwell's shoulders slumped slightly. He said nothing. The tension between the officers and the crowd continued to build. Derek could feel it, the way people were growing bolder, more vocal in their support. He knew that the presence of so many witnesses, all recording on their phones, was changing the dynamic. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was becoming a public reckoning. "Look around you, officer," Derek said, his voice rising. "These people see what you're doing. They know it's wrong, and they're not going to let you get away with it." Miller's eyes darted to the crowd, and Derek could see the moment of doubt flicker across his face. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not in a situation where he no longer had control. The people around them were no longer passive bystanders. They were participants, witnesses to the abuse of power, and they were growing angrier by the second. Gloria sat still, watching everything unfold. She had always been proud of Derek's ability to stay calm under pressure, and now, watching him stand up to these officers, her heart swelled with pride. But she also knew that this was just about today. This was about every injustice she had ever witnessed, every moment she had been made to feel less than because of the color of her skin or the limitations of her body. "You all see what's happening here," Gloria said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us, about how we're treated just because of who we are." Andrea Bell, the journalist, stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I've got this all on camera," she called out. "Everyone's going to see what you've done here." The crowd surged forward slightly, the murmurs growing louder. Miller's face hardened again, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. He had clearly underestimated how quickly the situation could turn against him. "Back off!" Miller barked at the crowd, his hand hovering near his taser. But the threat only seemed to embolden the onlookers. More voices rose in protest, and some people started to chant, "Justice for Gloria and no more harassment." Derek could feel the power of the crowd behind him. This was no longer just a personal battle. This was a stand against systemic injustice, and the people were ready to fight back. He stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. "This ends now," he said, locking eyes with Miller. "You've done enough. It's time for you to leave." Just as it seemed like the situation might boil over, sirens wailed in the distance. Derek turned his head to see a new police cruiser approaching, its lights flashing. The crowd murmured in anticipation as the car pulled up and a new officer stepped out, Detective Sarah Matthews. Detective Matthews was older, with graying hair and a non-nonsense attitude. She had been on the force for years, and though she had seen her fair share of confrontations, this one felt different. As she approached the scene, her sharp eyes took in the crowd, the phones recording, and the tension simmering in the air. "What's going on here?" Matthews demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Derek turned to face her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes still burning with resolve. "These officers have been harassing my mother, and it needs to stop." Matthews raised an eyebrow, glancing at Miller and Caldwell. "Is that so?" Miller opened his mouth to respond, but Matthews held up a hand, silencing him. "I want to hear from them," she said, pointing at the crowd. "What's been going on here?" The crowd, emboldened by the arrival of another authority figure, began to speak up. People shouted about how Gloria had been harassed, how the officers had been verbally abusive, and how the situation had escalated for no reason. Andrea Bell stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I've been recording the whole thing," she said. "You can see for yourself." Matthews sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. She had seen this kind of thing before, cops getting in over their heads, using their authority in all the wrong ways. She turned back to Miller and Caldwell, her expression hardening. "You two, back off. Right now." Miller bristled, but he knew better than to argue with a superior officer. He shot Derek and Gloria one last glare before stepping back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Caldwell, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke. "We were just trying to do our job," he said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Matthews gave him a withering look. "This isn't how we do our job," she said coldly. "Now get in the car and go." Miller and Caldwell hesitated for a moment, but Matthews' stern expression left no room for argument. They turned and walked back to their cruiser, the tension in the air slowly dissipating as the crowd watched them leave. With the officers gone, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many people came up to Gloria and Derek, offering words of support. Andrea Bell stayed behind, still recording as she interviewed people who had witnessed the event, determined to make sure that Gloria's story would be told far and wide. Detective Matthews approached Derek and Gloria, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry about what happened," she said, her voice quieter now that the crowd had thinned. "I'll make sure this is looked into." Derek nodded, his jaw still tight with lingering frustration. "This can't keep happening," he said. "People like my mother shouldn't have to live in fear of being harassed in their own neighborhood." Matthews sighed. "I know," she said, "and I'll do what I can. But I think you know as well as I do that the system moves slowly." Gloria, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. "Thank you, Detective," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "But we're not done fighting this." Derek looked at his mother, seeing the fire in her eyes. He had known it all along. Gloria was a fighter, and she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. As Matthews nodded and walked back to her cruiser, Derek turned to his mother. "We'll take this to court," he said firmly. "We'll make sure they're held accountable." Gloria smiled faintly, her hand resting on her son's arm. "I know we will," she said softly. "And I'm ready." The story reaches its first major climax as Derek confronts the officers and the crowd takes a stand against the injustice. The arrival of Detective Matthews serves as a turning point, diffusing the immediate conflict but setting the stage for the legal battle to come. Emotions run high as the community rallies behind Gloria, and the focus shifts toward the upcoming fight for justice. The story builds momentum toward the next peak, with tensions rising again as the courtroom battle looms. The neighborhood seemed quieter after the confrontation, though the tension still lingered in the air. Gloria Hartman sat in her living room, staring out the window at the street where the incident had unfolded. It had been 2 days since the officers had backed off, but the memory was fresh in her mind. She wasn't shaken by what had happened. Years of enduring systemic prejudice had hardened her spirit, but she was tired. Tired of always having to fight. Tired of always being questioned, always being othered in her own home. Derek, who had been staying with her since the incident, entered the room, his brow furrowed as he checked his phone. He had spent the last 2 days fielding calls from colleagues, reporters, and supporters. The video recorded by Andrea Bell had gone viral, sparking outrage not just in their community, but nationwide. The footage showed the officers' aggressive behavior, the thinly veiled racism, and the way the crowd had rallied behind Gloria. But despite the public support, Gloria could sense Derek's frustration. He was used to fighting battles in the courtroom, where the rules were clear and the law was on his side. This, however, was different. It wasn't just about the law, it was about changing minds, hearts, and a deeply ingrained system that had failed so many people for so long. "Mom," Derek said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts, "we need to talk about what happens next." Gloria turned to look at him, her expression soft but determined. "We're going to court," she said simply. "Those officers need to be held accountable." Derek nodded, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. "I'm already preparing the paperwork. We'll file a formal complaint against the police department and go after those officers for misconduct. But you know how these things go. It won't be easy." Gloria sighed, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She had seen enough of the world to know that justice wasn't always swift, and it wasn't always guaranteed. But this time, she couldn't let it go. "I know it won't be easy, Derek. But this time, we have to see it through." Derek sat down beside her, placing his hand on hers. "We will, Mom. We will." Later that afternoon, Gloria and Derek ventured outside for the first time since the incident. They were greeted by their neighbors, many of whom had come by to check on Gloria over the past 2 days. There was a sense of solidarity in the air, an unspoken understanding that what had happened to Gloria could happen to any one of them. This wasn't just Gloria's fight, it was their fight too. As they walked, or in Gloria's case, rolled down the street, they passed a small group of people holding signs. "Justice for Gloria and End Police Harassment" were scrawled across the boards in bold letters. It was a peaceful protest, but the passion behind it was unmistakable. Andrea Bell was there, standing near the front of the group, her camera slung over her shoulder. When she saw Gloria and Derek, she waved and made her way over to them. "I didn't expect this to grow so quickly," Andrea said, gesturing to the crowd. People saw the video and just started organizing. Everyone wants to see change. Gloria smiled faintly, touched by the outpouring of support. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said softly, "but am grateful. It's time we made our voices heard." Derek looked around at the people gathered, young and old, from different backgrounds, all united by a common cause. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about filing a lawsuit anymore. It was about using the momentum to push for broader changes, changes that could protect people like his mother from ever facing this kind of harassment again. "Thank you for everything, Andrea," Derek said. "We're going to need all the help we can get." Andrea nodded, her eyes determined. "You've got it. I'm not stopping until we get justice." The following week, Derek filed the formal complaint against Officers Miller and Caldwell, as well as the police department, citing misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. The case quickly gained traction, thanks in large part to the media attention brought by the viral video. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the names of the officers were splashed across headlines nationwide. But the fight wasn't going to be easy. The police department, eager to control the narrative, issued a statement calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding and claiming that the officers had acted within protocol. They promised a full internal investigation, but Gloria and Derek knew better than to trust that the system would hold itself accountable. At Derek's law office, a team of legal experts had gathered to strategize. Gloria sat at the head of the table, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, but she knew that her story could make a difference. "We need to be prepared for them to fight back hard," Derek said, addressing the group. "They'll try to paint my mother as a troublemaker, as someone who is being uncooperative. We can't let them twist the truth." One of the other lawyers, a sharp-witted woman named Stephanie, nodded. "We've got the video on our side. It's hard to argue against footage like that." Derek leaned forward, his face serious. "The video helps, but we need more. We need witness statements, character testimonials, anything that can show the jury who my mother really is. We need them to see that this isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a larger pattern of abuse." Gloria spoke up for the first time. "We also need to remember that this isn't just about me," she said quietly. "There are so many others out there who have been through the same thing. We need to give them a voice, too." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed Gloria's words. She was right. This case wasn't just about one woman's fight for justice. It was about a system that needed to change. As the court date drew closer, tensions in the community continued to rise. The protests outside the police station grew larger by the day, with more and more people joining the movement to demand justice. Signs bearing slogans like "Stop Police Abuse" and "Justice for All" filled the streets, and chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the air. Derek, though busy preparing for the trial, made time to attend several of the protests. He spoke at rallies, using his platform as a lawyer to call for reform and accountability within the police department. His words resonated with the crowd, and each day the movement grew stronger. But with the growing support also came backlash. Anonymous threats began trickling in, targeting both Gloria and Derek. Some people in the community, those who sided with the police, were angry that the issue had garnered so much attention. They saw Gloria and her supporters as troublemakers, stirring up unrest where there had been none before. One afternoon, as Gloria sat in her living room, she received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, The voice on the other end was cold and hostile. "You should drop this lawsuit," the voice said. "You're making things worse for everyone." Gloria's heart raced, but she didn't let fear seep into her voice. "I'm not dropping anything," she said firmly before hanging up. When Derek came home that evening, Gloria told him about the call. He frowned, his brow furrowed with concern. "This is what happens when people start to feel threatened," he said. "They lash out. But we can't let them intimidate us." Gloria nodded, but the weight of the fight was beginning to take its toll. She had always been strong, but this was unlike anything she had faced before. Still, she knew they couldn't back down. Not now. The morning of the trial arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. Gloria sat in the back seat of Derek's car, staring out at the city as they drove to the courthouse. Derek was focused, quiet in his determination, while Gloria's heart pounded in her chest. She had always been strong, but facing a room full of people who would dissect her every word, her every action, filled her with a nervous energy she couldn't shake. As they pulled up to the courthouse steps, they were greeted by a crowd of supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Gloria" and "Stop Racial Profiling Now." Journalists lined the walkway, snapping photos and shouting questions, but Derek kept his hand on his mother's wheelchair, guiding her through the chaos. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Miller sat at the defendant's table, his face set in a scowl. His partner, Officer Caldwell, looked more subdued, his eyes darting nervously around the room. They were flanked by their defense attorneys, who were prepared to argue that the officers had done nothing wrong, that they were simply doing their jobs. But Derek knew better. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, poring over the details of the case, reviewing witness testimonies, and analyzing the video footage that had sparked national outrage. He had one goal: to prove that what had happened to his mother was not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem. As the trial began, the judge entered, and the room fell silent. Gloria glanced at Derek, who gave her a reassuring nod. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Derek's strategy was simple: show the jury exactly what had happened through Gloria's eyes, and let them see the truth for themselves. After opening arguments, it was time for Gloria to take the stand. Derek helped her to the witness chair, her wheelchair positioned beside her, and the courtroom grew still as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. Derek stood nearby, ready to guide her through her testimony. The defense team watched closely, waiting for their chance to poke holes in her story, but Derek knew his mother's resolve. She wouldn't waver. "Mrs. Hartman," Derek began, his voice steady and calm, "can you please tell the court what happened the day you encountered Officers Miller and Caldwell?" Gloria took a deep breath and began to recount the events. She spoke of how she had been minding her own business, running her errands, when the officers had stopped her. She described how their attitudes quickly turned hostile, how their words were filled with disdain, and how they had treated her as if she didn't belong in her own neighborhood. "They didn't ask me any questions to understand," Gloria said, her voice calm but firm. "They assumed I was up to no good simply because of how I looked. They told me I didn't belong, and that's when I knew they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a problem." Her words hung in the air, and Derek could see the jurors' faces shift as they listened. This wasn't just about police protocol, it was about the deeper, more insidious issue of racial profiling. Gloria's story wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, one that too many people had experienced. The defense attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Prescott, stood to cross-examine Gloria. She approached the stand with a calculated smile, ready to challenge her. "Mrs. Hartman," Prescott began, her voice smooth, "you've lived in that neighborhood for quite some time, correct?" "Nearly 40 years, Gloria replied, keeping her voice steady. "And in all that time, you've never had an issue with the police before, correct?" "Not like this, no," Gloria said. Prescott nodded. "So, you would agree that this was an unusual incident?" Gloria paused, glancing at Derek before turning her attention back to Prescott. "Unusual, yes. But that doesn't mean it wasn't wrong." Prescott's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "You mentioned that the officers said you didn't belong. Could it be possible that they were referring to the fact that you were in a different part of the neighborhood, not that they were making a judgment about you personally." Gloria's eyes narrowed slightly. "I know what they meant," she said quietly but firmly. "I've heard those words before, in different ways, all my life. They weren't talking about geography. They were talking about me. About people like me." Derek watched as the defense attorney's smile faded. Gloria's quiet strength was undeniable, and no matter how many questions Prescott asked, she couldn't shake the truth of what had happened. Gloria had faced prejudice before, but now she had a platform to expose it. The next pivotal moment in the trial came when Officer Brian Caldwell took the stand. Derek knew that Caldwell would be the weak link. While Miller had been openly defiant, Caldwell had always shown signs of doubt, even during the incident itself. Derek hoped that, under pressure, Caldwell would reveal the truth. Caldwell sat nervously in the witness chair, his hands fidgeting slightly as he answered the initial questions from his own lawyer. He stuck to the usual defense, claiming that they had been following protocol, that they had suspected something was wrong and were just doing their job. But Derek had been watching Caldwell closely throughout the trial, and he knew there was more to the story. When it was Derek's turn to cross-examine, he approached Caldwell with a calm, deliberate demeanor. He didn't need to attack, he just needed to guide Caldwell to the truth. "Officer Caldwell," Derek began, his voice measured, "do you believe that my mother was committing any crime the day you stopped her?" Caldwell hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Officer Miller, who sat at the defense table watching him closely. "No, we didn't have any specific reason to believe she was committing a crime," Caldwell admitted reluctantly. Derek nodded, allowing the silence to linger for a moment before continuing. "So why did you stop her?" Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We were suspicious because she seemed out of place." "And what made her seem out of place?" Derek pressed. Caldwell swallowed hard. "It wasn't anything specific. We were just concerned." Derek stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Caldwell's. "Officer Caldwell, was it because of the way she looked? Because she didn't fit your idea of who should be in that part of the neighborhood?" Caldwell's face flushed, and he glanced nervously at his lawyer before looking back at Derek. I didn't think about it that way at the time, but maybe we were biased." The courtroom fell silent. Derek had known that Caldwell would crack under pressure, but hearing him admit that bias had played a role in their actions was a powerful moment. Gloria watched from her seat, her heart heavy but proud. This was the truth she had been fighting for. As the trial drew to a close, it was time for Derek to deliver his final argument. He stood before the jury, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about his mother anymore, it was about every person who had ever been subjected to prejudice, about a system that had failed to protect the vulnerable. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Derek said, his voice steady and clear, "what happened to my mother wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a clear example of racial profiling, of bias, of an abuse of power. The officers didn't see my mother as a person that day. They saw her as a threat, simply because of the color of her skin and where she was." He paced slowly in front of the jury, his eyes locking onto each of them. "This isn't just about one incident. This is about a system that allows people to be treated like second-class citizens because of their race, their age, their appearance. It's about how we, as a society, allow that to happen, time and time again." Derek paused, letting his words sink in. "My mother is not the first person to experience this, and sadly, she won't be the last. But today, you have the power to send a message that this kind of behavior is unacceptable, that people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." He turned and gestured to Gloria, who sat quietly in her wheelchair, watching him with pride. "My mother didn't ask for any of this. All she wanted was to live her life in peace, in the neighborhood she's called home for decades. But when that peace was taken from her, she stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong." Derek's voice softened, but his resolve was as strong as ever. "I ask you to see the truth, to see the injustice, and to hold those responsible accountable." The jury sat in silence, their faces a mixture of emotions. Derek could feel the weight of their deliberation, the way his words had impacted them. As he returned to his seat beside Gloria, he knew that they had done everything they could. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as everyone waited for the jury to return. Gloria sat quietly beside Derek, her hands resting in her lap, though her mind raced with the possibilities of what could come next. The trial had taken its toll on both of them, but through it all, Gloria had stood firm. She had faced the system, fought against the forces of prejudice and bias, and now all they could do was wait. Derek sat with his jaw clenched, glancing occasionally at his mother. He could see the weariness in her eyes, but he also saw something else, something that hadn't dimmed throughout the entire process, her resolve. She had faced more in her lifetime than most people ever would, and even now, at 68, she refused to back down. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jurors began to file back in. The judge called for silence, and the entire courtroom fell still. The foreman, an older woman with glasses perched on her nose, stood holding the small piece of paper that contained their decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, her voice steady. She handed the paper to the judge, who glanced at it before passing it back to her. The foreman cleared her throat and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officers Jack Miller and Brian Caldwell, guilty of misconduct and racial profiling." The words hung in the air for a brief moment before a wave of relief washed over the room. Gloria exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly as the tension left her body. Derek reached over and squeezed her hand, his own heart pounding with the realization that they had won. They had fought for justice, and this time they had succeeded. In the back of the courtroom, the crowd of supporters erupted in murmurs of approval, some even clapping quietly. Andrea Bell, the journalist who had recorded the initial incident, smiled broadly as she captured the moment on camera. This was what she had hoped for, a moment of accountability. Judge Taylor, an experienced and fair-minded judge, spoke up, restoring order in the courtroom. "Officers Miller and Caldwell, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. You abused your authority, and you violated the rights of a citizen under your care. You will be held accountable for your actions." Miller, sitting at the defense table, clenched his jaw in anger but remained silent. Caldwell, who had shown signs of guilt throughout the trial, looked down at his hands, seemingly resigned to his fate. The judge then moved on to sentencing. "Given the nature of the charges and the evidence presented, I am sentencing both officers to a period of community service in addition to mandatory sensitivity training and a permanent mark on their records. Furthermore, the police department will be required to undergo an internal review to address the culture that allowed this incident to happen." It wasn't a perfect victory. Derek had hoped for a harsher sentence, but he knew the importance of what they had achieved. They had exposed the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Miller to abuse their power, and the police department would be forced to confront those issues. Change was slow, but it had to start somewhere. The media exploded with coverage of the verdict. Gloria's story, already a symbol of resistance, became a national headline. News outlets praised her courage, and Derek's legal victory was hailed as a step forward in the fight for police accountability. Protests calling for further reform continued to grow, not just in Green Valley, but in cities across the country. People were waking up to the reality of systemic bias, and Gloria's case had become a rallying cry. Derek was interviewed on national television, where he spoke passionately about the need for broader changes in the criminal justice system. He used his platform to advocate for stronger policies against racial profiling, better training for officers, and the creation of independent oversight committees to hold law enforcement accountable. Gloria, however, was more comfortable staying out of the spotlight. After the trial, she returned to her quiet life in Green Valley, grateful that the ordeal was behind her. But even as the media attention swirled around her, she knew that this victory wasn't just for her, was for all the people who had been marginalized, silenced, and ignored for far too long. One afternoon, as Gloria sat on her porch, enjoying the calm after the storm, Mrs. Ellis, her neighbor, came by to visit. "You've made quite the impact, Gloria," Mrs. Ellis said, sitting down beside her. "People are talking about you everywhere." Gloria smiled softly, her hands resting in her lap. "It's not just about me, Mrs. Ellis. It's about all of us. This was just one step in a much bigger fight." Mrs. Ellis nodded, her eyes full of admiration. "Still, you were brave. Not everyone would have stood up the way you did." Gloria shook her head. "I wasn't brave. I was just tired of being treated like I didn't matter. And I'm tired of seeing it happen to other people, too. We deserve better." Weeks after the trial, Derek and Gloria sat together in her living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Gloria's physical injuries had healed, but the emotional toll would take longer to mend. Still, there was a sense of closure, a feeling that they had done something important. "I've been thinking," Derek said, breaking the comfortable silence. "This case, it's just the beginning. There's so much more work to be done." Gloria looked at him, her eyes soft but knowing. "I know. But you can't do it all on your own, Derek." "I'm not alone, Mom," Derek replied. "We've got a whole community behind us now. People are ready to make real changes." Gloria nodded slowly, her mind drifting back to the day of the incident, when she had first encountered Officers Miller and Caldwell. So much had changed since that day, but in many ways, the fight was just beginning. She had always known that Derek would do great things, but seeing him in action, seeing how he had used the law to protect her and others, filled her with a pride that words couldn't express. "You've always had a fire in you," Gloria said, her voice soft. "Even when you were a little boy, I knew you were meant to fight for something bigger than yourself." Derek smiled, his hand resting on his mother's arm. "I learned that from you. You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." Gloria squeezed his hand. "We're in this together, son. Always." In the months following the trial, significant changes began to take root in the Green Valley Police Department. The internal review ordered by the court uncovered several instances of misconduct, and a number of officers were disciplined. New policies were implemented, focusing on de-escalation training, racial sensitivity, and accountability measures. An independent oversight board was established, giving the community a voice in how their police department operated. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from the people of Green Valley themselves. Inspired by Gloria's courage, they organized community meetings to discuss policing, racial equity, and justice. Derek continued to be a vocal advocate, helping to guide policy changes both locally and nationally. Gloria's case had sparked a larger movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. Her story became a symbol of the fight for fairness and equality, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's courage could ignite change. As the months passed, life in Green Valley began to feel more normal again. Gloria returned to her daily routines, but there was a new sense of peace in the air. She knew that the world wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting a golden light on the streets below, Gloria sat on her porch, watching the world go by. She listened to the sounds of children playing, the distant hum of conversation, and the peaceful rhythm of life continuing. The fear that had once gripped her heart was gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that things were changing for her, for Derek, and for all the people who had been fighting for so long. Gloria took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the evening wash over her. She knew there would always be challenges ahead, but now she had seen what was possible. Together, with her son and her community, they had turned pain into power. And with each passing day, the world was becoming a little more just. Months after the trial, Gloria's story was still being told, not just in Green Valley but across the country. Her face had appeared in newspapers and on television screens, but more importantly, her story had inspired others to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better. Derek continued his work as a civil rights attorney, using his mother's case as a foundation for broader reforms. He had helped draft new policies that were being implemented in cities across the nation, all aimed at reducing bias and increasing police accountability. As for Gloria, she found peace in knowing that her fight had not been in vain. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and she was proud to have played a part in that change. She knew there would always be struggles ahead, but she also knew that she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through all the trials of her life. Together, Gloria and Derek had shown the world what could happen when people refused to be silenced. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for reading this powerful story about courage, justice, and change. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to stay updated with our latest stories. We value your thoughts. Leave a comment to share your feelings about Gloria's journey and the fight for justice. Your voice matters. About how things ended. Ethan remained silent, allowing Ryan the space to speak. He had spent a long time processing his own feelings, but he was curious to hear what Ryan had to say now. I made a lot of mistakes, Ryan continued, his tone filled with regret. I let my anger and my frustrations cloud my judgment. I treated you unfairly. I saw things that weren't there because I didn't want to see the truth. And I've been paying for that ever since. Ethan didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of Ryan's words settle in. He could hear the sincerity in Ryan's voice, but he also knew that words alone weren't enough to undo what had been done. Ryan looked up at Ethan, his expression earnest. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I don't expect you to just forget everything that happened. But I needed to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did, for how I treated you. I've been going to counseling, trying to understand why I let myself get to that point, and I realized I have a lot of work to do. Ethan turned to face Ryan, his expression calm but thoughtful. I appreciate you coming here, he said after a long pause. But you're right. This isn't about forgiveness, not entirely. It's about accountability. You had the power in that situation, and you abused it. Ryan nodded, his face tightening as he accepted the truth in Ethan's words. I know, and I've been thinking about that every day. I let my biases control me. I know I can't change what happened, but I want to make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone. Ethan's gaze softened slightly. He could see that Ryan was sincere in his regret, but he also knew that real change came through actions, not just words. Still, the fact that Ryan was here, admitting his mistakes, was a step in the right direction. You've taken the first step by admitting it, Ethan said. We're going to be okay, Layla, he said, his voice steady but soft. Ryan nodded again, his expression one of quiet determination. I'm working on it. I've joined a program at the department to help address these issues, and I'm trying to learn. It's going to take time, but I'm committed. Ethan considered this for a moment, then spoke with a calm but firm tone. People like me, people of color, don't get to make those mistakes without paying a heavy price. You were lucky to have the opportunity to reflect and rebuild. Most people don't get that chance. Ryan lowered his head. I know. And that's something you'll carry with me. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past hanging between them. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't filled with hostility or tension, but rather an understanding that, while they couldn't change the past, they could both work toward something better. I won't pretend this fixes everything, Ethan finally said, his voice measured. But I'm glad you're taking responsibility. That's more than a lot of people do. Ryan nodded, his face showing a mixture of relief and humility. Thank you, Ethan. I'll do better. With that, Ryan stood up, offering a small nod before walking away. Ethan watched him go, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes that was enough. The days that followed felt lighter. Ethan and Sophia had resumed their normal routines, but the experience with Ryan had left its mark on them both. They knew that the fight for justice was ongoing and that there were many others out there facing the same struggles. But for now, they had found some peace. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees, Sophia turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with warmth. You did the right thing, she said softly. Ethan smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. It wasn't easy. Sophia leaned her head on his shoulder. I know, but that's what makes it important. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. The world outside was still filled with challenges, but here In this moment, they had found a bit of stillness, a space where they could just be. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a long pause. "Maybe it's time for us to get more involved. Not just in our own fight, but in helping others who are going through the same thing." Sophia lifted her head, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with purpose. "I've been talking to some folks at the local veterans group, and they're starting a program to help veterans of color who are dealing with discrimination. I think I want to help them with that." Sophia's face lit up with pride. "That sounds perfect for you." Ethan smiled, feeling a renewed sense of direction. "Yeah, I think it's time I put my experiences to good use." Brian Carter had returned to his program at the department, working closely with the team tasked with addressing bias in law enforcement. It wasn't easy, and every day felt like a reminder of the mistakes he had made. But he was committed to doing the work, to understanding where he had gone wrong and how he could do better. He had started attending community meetings, listening to the stories of people who had been impacted by police misconduct. It was uncomfortable at times, hearing their anger and pain, but Ryan knew he had to confront these truths if he was going to make any real progress. At one of the meetings, he sat quietly in the back, taking notes as community members shared their experiences. A woman stood up, her voice trembling as she recounted her son's run-in with law enforcement, a situation that had escalated unnecessarily, leaving her son traumatized. Ryan listened closely, his heart heavy. He could see the parallels between her story and what had happened with Ethan. It was a painful reminder of how easily things could go wrong when officers let their biases influence their actions. After the meeting, Ryan approached the woman, introducing himself with humility. "I'm Ryan Carter. I'm a police officer, and I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened to your son." The woman looked at him with surprise, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she said bluntly. Ryan nodded, accepting her response. "You're right, but I'm trying to learn, to be better. I just wanted you to know that." The woman studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see if your actions match your words." Ryan knew she was right. Words meant little without action, and it was up to him to prove that he was committed to change. Months later, Ethan and Sophia found themselves standing in front of a small crowd at the grand opening of the new community center. The center was dedicated to providing support for veterans and their families, with a special focus on addressing the challenges faced by veterans of color. It had been a project close to Ethan's heart, and today it was finally becoming a reality. Sophia stood beside him, beaming with pride, as Ethan stepped up to the podium to give a speech. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice steady and strong. "This center represents more than just a building. It represents a commitment to standing together, to supporting each other, and to fighting for the rights of those who have served this country, regardless of their background." The crowd applauded, the energy in the room warm and uplifting. "We've all faced challenges," Ethan continued, "but those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we lift each other up, and how we keep pushing for a better future." As Ethan finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation had come to an end, and many of the people involved had been brought to justice. Sophia hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled, holding her close. "We did it." In the months that followed, Ethan and Sophia continued to grow their involvement in the community. The new center became a hub for veterans and families, a place where people could come together to share their stories, find support, and work toward solutions. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, had fully committed to his new role within the department, working to address bias and promote better community relations. It wasn't always easy, and he faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, but he knew that the work was important. One day, as Ryan was leaving a meeting at the department, he ran into Ethan in the hallway. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Ryan returned the nod, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change the past, They were both working toward a better future. As they went their separate ways, both men felt a sense of resolution, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that they were walking it in the right direction. The sun was setting on a warm evening as Ethan and Sophia sat on their porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world around them was still filled with challenges, but they had found their place in it, standing together, fighting for justice, and building something better for the next generation. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophia reached over and took Ethan's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And we've still got a long way to go." Sophia nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "But we'll get there." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, ready for whatever battles the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more like it, filled with powerful lessons, compelling characters, and deep emotional journeys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to share meaningful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. We're committed to bringing you stories that explore important issues, from justice to resilience and everything in between. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the themes explored in this story. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and well, see you in the next video. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love, it was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.